excellent stuff. Thank you. It's all right. Ian wasn't able to make it yesterday, but we thought this presentation was so valuable that we would bring it over to today. So Ian's going to talk about the work that he did with Salix and a few other people on the Olympic wetlands. So I'll leave it to Ian to take over.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to talk here today. I was meant to be on later this afternoon, but they've bumped me up the list so that I can scoot away to another meeting. So thanks for the flexibility. This was a project I was involved in, well, from the conception really. 2006 I was involved in writing and putting together the environmental statement for the Olympic Park development. And as part of that was all the commitment to the mitigation and habitat enhancement works, which I was fortunate enough to see through in terms of my involvement in actually undertaking the designs of the wetland habitats, river edge improvement works through the Olympic site. So it's a site I know very well. We talk about those projects that can give you grey hairs. This was certainly one of those. Time was of the essence. We couldn't miss the deadline, so it's very time constrained, different to a lot of projects people might be working on. Financially it wasn't. So we could throw quite a bit of money at the solutions that I'm going to be presenting here. So these might be a bit overkill for some of the smaller projects that people might be working on, but I just thought it was worth mentioning that fact that, you know, we had to hit the deadline and it had to look good for when the games opened. So some of our approaches may seem a little over the top. My client said to me on our first meeting, if it all looks like a sad bag of weeds, it's your fault. So that wasn't a good start. When David came on board as an advisor to Atkins, I told him the same thing, so I sort of passed the responsibility down the line a little. So I'll start with a little bit of background. I don't know whether many of you know the Olympic site, if you were fortunate to get down there and see the games, but you have the River Lee that runs right through the centre of the park. It's the arterial route really, and it was decided by the landscape architects, LDA Hargreaves, that would form a main focal point for the habitat improvement works. So the top end of the site, the idea was that you had large wetland features and then maintain some ecological connectivity with improvements to some of the hard-edged river walls down the bottom end of the site. Around the stadium, this was Stadium Island. There was a river called Pudding Mill River, which we filled in to build the stadium on top. But this is the Bowback Loop canal system, and British Waterways are obviously very interested in that and opening it up to navigation again, because when we came on site, you can see from this video at the bottom that it sort of doesn't... Oh. This is taken from a footbridge over where the main wetland area, so this is in 2006, so excuse the quality of the video, it was a windy day. But you can see that there was limited public access to the river, very steep banked. The river at that stage was intertidal. You can probably see from the toe of the bank, but Dave talked about this, these fluctuating water levels leaving a mud toe. A lot of shrub and trees on the banks, but also a huge amount of debris and contaminants. We had a full complement of invasive plant species, giant hogweed, Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, floating pennywort in the river, Chinese mitten crabs in the river, bit of crashula here and there, so on and so forth. So it was a really grotty site. I've been careful here. I said of limited ecological value because, you know, the bird surveys actually on site revealed that these habitats were, you know, quite an important habitat within the urban setting. So it was a bit gruff, to be honest. I mentioned LDA Hargreaves. They were the master planners. Hargreaves was the guy who did the Sydney Olympics. He was brought on board by LDA, who are an architectural firm working out of London. And they came up with the general concept of the creation of main wetland areas, enhanced river margins, wet woodlands and frog ponds. And as Atkins, it was our job. We had a strange, sort of relatively new term that was phrased by the late, great Hopkins as landscape engineers. So it was our job to fit their aspirations to the park, to actually make it work. And underpinning all of this was the Olympic Biodiversity Action Plan. That was part of the Section 106 agreement from the planning, that we had to make a commitment to the amount of habitat that was created on site targeting various habitats and species. And throughout the entire process, we undertook a lot of consultation with key statutory stakeholders, the Environment Agency, the Lee Valley Regional Park, Natural England, and others. So we took the master plan, and we thought, right, well, let's try and identify, first of all, what are the main challenges that we're going to have on site in order to realise what the architects and what the Olympics ultimately wanted. The first and biggest issue we faced was the fact that there was going to be a change in the fluvial regime. I mentioned the Bowback Canal system around the bottom end of the park. In order to make that navigable again, British Waterways slipped through under their permissive development rights the Prescott Lock and Three Mills water control structures. In effect, that's the photograph at the top corner here, that's on the Three Mills Wall River. What that was to do was to impound water levels upstream in through the Olympic Park to allow barges and navigation to take place. It was sold as an idea that we'd be shipping in all the materials to build the Olympics by boat. I won't pretend that never happened. There were obviously a few little things we moved through, but the whole idea was that British Waterways in legacy would have a really nice system where people would want to come and visit, moor their boats and spend time in the park as the Queen Elizabeth Gardens, as it's now known. So along with this change in fluvial regime, so the river was intertidal, were issues in terms of anticipated boat wash, which could affect habitat and vegetation establishment associated with the wetlands. And we were dealing with a huge amount of contamination on site. The water quality, which is a catchment-wide issue, was out of our remit and was being dealt with in wider catchment initiatives. Things like the super sewer that they're now building to try and intercept some of the surface water flow before it gets into the river systems. And we were also constrained by space. We had to work amongst, within a landscape where people were building stadiums, velodromes, drainage networks, new power systems, all sorts. And the main constraint, of course, was time. We needed to get this thing built very, very quickly, and it needed to look good, not like a sad bag of weeds. So in terms of the design aspects, we needed to provide this sustainable green solution. That required us to make sure that we had appropriate species selection for inclusion in the wetlands. We had to integrate with all these other work elements that I've talked about, and we had issues of maintaining ecological connectivity. The park was, in effect, an extension of the Lee Valley Regional Park, and is this green corridor route through the River Lee down towards the River Thames. So those were some of our main challenges. In establishing any wetland habitat, I went and chatted to the guy who built Barnes Wetland Centre, and he said the first thing you need to do is have complete control over your water levels. I said we need to create wetlands. They need to be online. They need to be in hydrological and ecological connectivity with the river habitats. We can't control water levels. He said, well, you're scuppered. So we thought, okay, let's take that away. And let's undertake some modelling so at least we understand exactly what we're dealing with in terms of water level fluctuation. And what this little video image here shows is just a simple 1D ISIS flow model. They've changed the name from ISIS now, unsurprisingly. But this here is the, there's an American thing as well, this here is the water level control structure. This is the Olympic Park site through here. And this is the tide coming up and down. So you can see that the river becomes tide lock, and you get these twice daily fluctuations on an average flow of around 300 to 400 millimetres. So on average flow, we just get this wetting and drying cycle on the river margins. And yeah, we're planting wetland plants. They don't mind being wet, they don't mind being inundated, but there are only a few species which really tend to cope well with this regular fluctuation that we see. We do have some control over water levels in that we can ask the control people at the water level structure to actually manage them for us at particularly low levels in order for us to install stuff, but all in all we pretty much were stuck with what we're seeing here. I spoke to David. We got David on board as our advisor on the quiet, and I asked if he had any plants that we could trial, because we were aware that we needed to, before we get going with this, really understand the palette of plants that we're going to be using and where we can use them. We couldn't face the issue of, 2 months before the games having to replace a whole load of plants on the site. So this is actually on the Olympic Park. So this is an on-site planting trial installed in September 2008. And we were able to run this for 2 years before it started to conflict with other infrastructure on site, and this riverbank actually got removed and reprofiled. What we did is we trialled various plant species. I think there were 7. We had in our mind 7 key species that we could use in the wetland and river margin area, and various approaches and on various bank types. So we have slope banks, we have terrace banks, we had pre-established coir pallets, we had bare root plug planted stock, we had bare root stock, we had plug planting through jute matting, plug planting just straight into the soil surface. And I say we monitored this over 2 years, and we calculated inundation frequency and duration at each of the treatment levels, and we undertook biometric monitoring, simple things like density of plants, above ground biomass, survival rate of plants, so that we could build a picture of what was surviving where at the elevation that we'd be creating the wetlands and river banks. And what this did is it was used to inform us on the constraints and the management of these constraints as we move through the project. So constraints identified at trial, these are all taken actually at the footprint of the trial. Terrible stuff leaching out the banks. We had 15 metres of made ground in some areas. We had an old abattoir on site, so there were bones falling out of the place and all sorts. It was a real mess. A lot of this contamination was remediated through the provision of a human health layer and treatment of groundwater. A lot of the groundwater in the Bagshot gravels was pumped out and treated and then put back in. So contamination from the ground wasn't going to necessarily be a concern, but it still remained in terms of contamination for water flowing down the River Lee and the sediment deposition that was associated with that. And here we have a little photograph of some of the rates of accretion we were seeing. 200 millimetres of sediment on one event. 3 months before the Olympics, we had a huge event, and we had 400 millimetres of sediment come down the River Lee and deposit that over our plants. Luckily, we'd gone for a very mature plant stock in order to deal with that. But we had significant issues with fine sediment deposition. So this talk is as much about sort of managing with sediment as opposed to managing of catchment sediment. In terms of the trial, we had complete loss of all plug plants on the bank. This wetting and drying cycle was actually acting to suck the plug plants out of the bank. We also had grazing geese, which were doing a very good job of trimming off the top of any of all plant treatments. And we were seeing localised bank erosion as well as part of this drawing down that David mentioned earlier. The other problem we had was we had a huge amount of non-native invasive species and weeds coming in on trial, including proper weed. A remarkable number. This was nicknamed Colin the cannabis plant, and lots of people have their photograph of this. But these were popping up all over the banks. I don't know why. Along with Himalayan balsam was the other main plant that was being deposited by hydrocoiring, so seeds caught up in sediment and within the flow of the river. So we used all of these trial elements to, as I say, put in this design risk mitigation, so we knew what to plant, where to plant it in terms of what elevation, and how to plant it in terms of the techniques that we should be using to install the plants in the wetlands and river margins. Salix were appointed as our grow and supply contractor. They didn't install. Nuttall had various other install contractors on site. Is this true? You increased the nursery size to double the nursery size in order to grow what were just over 300,000 plants that were delivered for. So when I'm talking about the scale and cost, we hit this. The density of plants we used in the pallets were probably twice what I've used on other schemes, because we know we needed this immediate establishment on site. We were lucky, we were sensible enough, shall I say, to collect local provenance seed back in 2007. This seed was held by British Flora. We undertook viability testing, so a lot of the reed beds, a lot of the Phragmites, common reed that was used in the wetlands was actually sourced from small pockets of Phragmites that were actually on site before the Olympics was built. So that was quite a nice thing to be involved in. And the delivery to site started in the summer of 2010, planted right through 2010 into 2011, and then we kept our fingers crossed up to 2012. This is me here, seeding hairline, you can see. And we're inspecting one of the coir pallets that was used on the wetlands and river edges, and we specified the requirements of these pallets quite stringently. But then often the success is not in the design, it's in the quality of the product that is delivered to site and how that product is cared for and installed. Stringent specification. We had various biometrics. Each plant or mat of plants that left the site had to meet certain standards before it would even be accepted on the Olympics. And Salix were exceptionally good at maintaining a very good audit trail throughout that process. And they were the only people that could grow to this scale and deliver the product. And these are, if you had a look around their nursery, these are just some photographs that were taken back in 2010. In terms of wetland design management, we picked up the issues associated with fluctuating water levels, and we were still very much concerned that although we knew what plants would survive at various levels and what would do well, that they could still potentially reduce establishment rates on site. So we took the decision on the main wetland features. There were 3 wetlands on site. The largest, they amounted to, everyone uses this, to 3 football pitches in size. That's the total area of the wetlands. We created this sort of mogul effect. So what we did is we made sure that we hoped somewhere on the wetlands there would be the appropriate physical chemical conditions in order for the plant to get established. The photograph that looks like a zebra was sent to me by the client with an email that said, "Zebra wetlands, was this your intention?" And I replied with yes. The intention was to establish the plants at a level, and then from that parent plant, it didn't take long for that plant to actually feed the rest of the treatments. So we put in design management such as these moguls. It also had the advantage, and you can see it quite clearly here, of drawing water from the river at relatively low flows and wetting up the bank, so it provided moisture to the lower toe of the bank where we would also be providing, installing wetland plants. It was as simple as providing the contractor with a sheet like this. This is the length of bank, 30 odd metres in length. These are individual pallets of different species mixes, combination of single species or mixed pallets. And it was no more intelligent than going along and going, okay, I'll peg that one there. Okay, I need another A, I'll peg that there, so on and so forth. And the reason we went with that is that we know that there were going to be a huge amount of pallets delivered to site at once, and we didn't want them sitting around baking in the sun and drying out. So we did have provision. We had wet beds on site, like you'll see at Salix nurseries, to hold these things, but we did have problems with the contractor just leaving these things in bundles and not irrigating them. So again, in terms of specification, dealing with products when they get on site is another really important aspect to make sure that your product is in as good a condition as it can be before it's installed. Establishment measures, difficult to see, but we put up temporary silt curtains just to try and deal with some of the issues with the fine sediment that was coming in, and we overdid it on bird exclusion netting. Someone told me that birds see orange very clearly. I think they were fibbing. So we had a lot of orange and net-on fencing and bird deterrent measures such as reflector tapes, and we had periodic controlled inundation. We asked the control structure at Prescott just to shut up. That lifted the entire water levels through the site, so we could irrigate the water bank by simply just controlling water levels in that way. So when we had some very dry periods, we actually just flooded the site in order to irrigate and then drew it back down very slowly. Dealing with boat wash, Dave talked about this in his earlier presentation. This is adjacent to the aquatics centre. This photograph here, the river is actually just beyond these sheep piles. We stepped back, it was just a hard edge canal, the vetted canal. We stepped that back 8 metres, single species Phragmites. Coir roll, rock roll at the front to dissipate the boat energy, reinforced coir pallets with slightly higher density coir fibre to reduce the likelihood of breakdown, and then various coir rolls of high density again through the treatment again to try and break up this wave action, because when these barges were coming through, it was a very narrow canal, we were getting serious, significant waves moving across the treatments once they'd plasma cut this sheep pile wall down. So that's what we looked at in terms of sort of slightly harder engineering where it was required, and it's about the appropriate use of engineering. Talking about protecting assets, we had a number of situations where we couldn't provide very slack slopes which could be planted up with wetland plants, especially on approaches to bridges as shown here. So a little shot here of some turf being rolled out up the bank. Again, it was a rapid, immediate landscape effect, very quick to install. And this was, it wasn't C350, it was a similar product, coir with a 3D matrix, blinded with topsoil, seeded with a specified seed mix, and grown here at Ash Girdler's nurseries. We had a problem here. The client came down to visit. He was, his background was building golf courses in America. He thought the grass looked a bit scraggly and instructed the contractor to mow it to within an inch of its life to get it to grow quicker. I pointed out that we had sown annual flowers, and he managed to cut all those annuals out of the actual seed mix. So we had to start again with various bits. So not only a stringent specification, but making sure that the contractor sticks to any specification, and that the client also appreciates the importance of why that specification has been put together. But these not only, I say, act to provide an immediate landscape effect, they provide soil stabilisation and control of fine sediment input from the rather friable banks that we had in this area. The C350, although it provides its own shear stress control, the best thing about it is its strength allows you to roll it out in these long lengths. So it actually gives the product its strength as well to install in this manner. Okay, so I'll summarise very quickly. I think I've probably overshot a little bit. Early identification of site constraints is obviously key, because it allows you to implement this appropriate design management, so you're not sort of risking having to rework later on within the programme. Think also about, once your product is in, exactly how you're going to maintain it, what measures need to be undertaken in terms of litter picking, clearing of weeds that might become established within any wetland treatment areas. I keep going back to this, but specifications are of the utmost importance, and making sure those control measures are actually implemented on any products you receive. In terms of the programme, lead-in time for products. All our plants went through at least one growing season within the Salix nurseries. We ideally wanted 2, so we actually had to procure most of this material most of these plants before we knew exactly where we were going to put them. So there was some risk there. So we included I think it was a 5 or 10% overgrow requirement, 5% on top of that 300,000, and I think testament to the work that we did at Atkins and through advice from various specialist contractors, including Salix, we actually didn't use any of that overgrow at all within this. We had no failures of any planting along the riverbanks. So that's it from me. I'll leave you with a few photographs of the Olympic site in its glory. My colleague Mike Vaughan, there's some rustling in the reeds when he was there, and Dave Holland popped out of them, more interested in seeing how his plants were doing than watching Mo Farah run very quickly, I think. But yeah, these are some shots just in the northern bit of the park of the wetlands and main wet woodland and river edge treatment areas. Thank you.